presentation I gave yesterday at Hamilton? Good. No, it's nice to see there are no gluttons for punishment. I just asked because this is a different talk. Okay, so if they think they got it yesterday, they got a different talk. And I'm going to talk about urban trees and sustainable and livable cities. And quite clearly, I'm going to also talk about botanic gardens with this particular group. And I thought I'd begin with that. Some of you would recognise that's not a recent photograph. It's one of my, I have a postcard collection, quite extensive postcard collection. And I have a number of botanic gardens in that collection. And from time to time I use the slides to look at trees as they were perhaps in the 1920s, for example, in some cases. Sadly, I don't have any postcards of Warrnambool. Isn't that interesting? Don't have them. Visited here often as a kid, and this was a postcard that I sent to my parents in the 1970s, early 1970s or late 1960s. And you're going to see a couple of those on the way through that just show you, give you a glimpse of what I thought Warrnambool was like and where I used to go. And then I'm going to talk about botanic gardens. And there are a few things that I wanted to remind you. I'm interested in trees and have been for a long time. And I'm interested in them for a whole range of reasons. And one is that they provide a link through time. So for example, when we're in your garden today, we saw the Viminalis, or the remnants of some of the Viminalis. And I'm really pleased that you're growing some more of those so that that link through time will continue. They give a sense of permanence, and for many of us, nothing else does. You might like to think that your home is permanent, but I'm looking at homes in the west and to the east of Melbourne that have only been there since the 1970s. Big blocks already been cleared, haven't even made it to sort of 50 years. So you sort of think what you build is going to last, but very often it doesn't. It has to be special. But of course trees, 150, 200, 250, 500, 600 years is all possible. And so that gives you a real sort of connection to the past. And of course, they're the link to nature, the habitat, all of the wildlife that they support. Even a single tree provides habitat for far more species than most people realise. Not everyone is keen on the species that the tree is providing habitat for. Some don't like the fungi, some don't like the insects, some don't like the spiders. But you take the good with the bad, don't you, when you've got that sort of offer being made. And of course they're beautiful, and the significant tree register tries to link them with history and heritage, and not just the last 100 or 150 years, but if we can find those links that go way back, we work with the indigenous people as well. And the other point I wanted to make is that the reason we have tree green spaces varies, but very often people only think of them as beautiful, decorative, ornamental. They've very rarely just been that, almost never. When you put aside a significant packet of land, and when you did it in Victoria, you often did it in the 1850s to the 1880s, 1890s, that land was amongst the most valuable piece of turf on the planet because of the gold rush. And so people didn't just say, oh, we'll give, what is it up there, 8 hectares, because we just feel good about it. They gave you those spaces for a particular purpose. And some of the purposes are listed on that slide. They were there for beauty, but they were also there for political reasons. Those gardens served other functions in a socio-political context. So, for example, many of the gardens associated with the British Empire from about 1850 have really good gardens because of the French Revolution. Now, people don't make the connection, but they provided really good gardens because they didn't want the working class to fulminate the revolution like the French working class did. And they thought that if they created a top-class garden where people could go through that garden on their day off, all of those sorts of things, it would keep the workers, the lower classes satisfied. They'd be less likely to revolt. And it seems to have worked. Okay? So, the functions are often really quite subtle. And others of you in this room now will know that some of the sites of various gardens are because they were wet, they needed drainage, they wanted soak-up sites, all of those sorts of things. And today, our public open spaces and our treed green spaces also fulfil really significant functions of a very diverse nature, which I'll talk a little bit about should time allow. And just to illustrate a couple of points, probably recognise this is one of the big old river red gums of Melbourne. It was photographed in 1885. This is my photograph of the same tree in 1985. Doesn't look too good, does it? 2005, the tree is gone. And it's a river red gum, and people said, oh, well, it had a good life. It lived for about 400 years, and it was 400 years old. But now put yourself in the position of the river red gum. Wouldn't you be dark on it? You were growing there, you had success for 350 years, had every reason to be looking at 700 or 800 years, and then we came along. And we put driveways, we took everything out around it, we altered its complete environment. And then we thought it had done all right to make it to 400. That tree must have been shirty on the fact that we did it out of 400 years. Must have been. But things are not always worse, are they? Does Tower Hill look like that now?
No. Full of weeds.
Okay. A lot of weeds, but a lot of trees and other things as well.
Yeah.
So these things change, and sometimes they change for the better, and sometimes they change for the worse. And I'm going to sort of link that to climate change. This is a shot that I use with my students, and I often ask them, what do they see? And because they're working with me on trees, what do you think they see? They see the tree. Okay? It's a mountain ash. It's a massive mountain ash down in Gippsland. But it's not about the tree. This is a family portrait in front of their home. So this is a hollow mountain ash, and we know that at least 3 other families lived in the tree, and that's the parents and the kids in front of their home. Interesting, isn't it? Different perception of how you see things. And my view here, of course, is that things do change. We have to accept that. When you manage a botanic garden, it's going to go through different phases. Are there going to be good times, bad times? You're going to have funds, you're not going to have funds. You're going to have storms, trees are going to disappear. You're going to have opportunities to plant or not, as the case may be. And one of the things that I used to sort of love about the Burnley Gardens is that they were a teaching garden. They were a teaching garden. People would often come into my office, people who'd wandered through, and they'd say, that tree over there looks terrible. What sort of botanist here, what sort of botanic gardens is this? And boy, did I get into them. Because students were doing work, and sometimes students make mistakes. One of our students, for example, very early on in their course, went out to one of the tree ferns and took every frond off it. Now, it didn't kill it or anything, you know what tree ferns are like, tough as boots. And we said to him, why on earth would you do that? And he said, I thought it was a really strange instruction, and he completely misunderstood what he was asked to do. And so he went out and thought, well, they probably know. And the moral from that story was, if someone on staff asks you to do something and it doesn't make any sense, question them. Ask them. Don't just go along with it. And that was the philosophy we had at Burnley. And we did other things. We tried things. Do you flush cut? Do you cut at an angle? Those sorts of things. So you could see things on the trees that we tried. And it was one of those great things because you expected the trees to change, respond, and sometimes you were going to cop a bit of a flack for it, but sometimes the results were really, really worthwhile, and then you had a big smile on your face. So, again, just a couple of shots. Are there more trees in Warrnambool now than when I was here in 1969? Okay. Are they good trees? Are they being looked after? Are they valued by your council? Are they valued by your citizens? Okay. What role are they going to play in climate change? How valuable are they? Each one. What's it worth? You can put a dollar value on them. You mightn't like it, and I don't like it either. But you can actually walk up to a tree, and I've seen a couple today, and if you put a valuation on them, they'd be worth $50,000, maybe to 70, 80, and some even $100,000. Okay, and you might say, well, how can you actually calculate a value? There are ways that economists put values on things that aren't part of the usual market. Okay, so there are techniques for doing it. And you're going to hear a lot more about this over the next 4 or 5 years, because Arboriculture Australia has just put out a brand new method that they hope will be used to value trees Australia-wide. Now, if that takes off, can you imagine the difference that's going to make to people making decisions? I'm going to cut through all those trees for power lines. No, you're not, because they're worth that much, and we want you to consider that. Okay, if they're worth that much and we've got to compensate, we'll put the power underground. And in case you're wondering, just this week I was reading an article from the States where they're boring, tunnelling, using plasma technology. So you've all seen the boring equipment. So if we wanted to bore under all of your Norfolk Island pines for cables, we can do it. Okay, we've got the equipment now. And if you hit a rock, you back up, you go round, and some of the pipes they put through are a flexible ribbon. They pull them through after the boring's done, then they blow them up, they put a solvent in, they harden up, you've got a pipe. Okay? Brilliant. But of course, you live on the basalt plains. There's quite a bit of rock. And so, we can't do it out here. Not possible. Well, with this new technology it is. And the companies that are pushing this technology in the United States and Europe actually claim that it's much, much cheaper than open trenching. Much cheaper. And boring under trees is often cheaper than open trenching. So you ask, why do they open trench? Habit. So, what do trees do? Again, botanic gardens, you know about the aesthetic of the vegetation. You know about the design, the focus. But have you thought about how important a sense of scale is? Now, we human beings may not appreciate the fact that we have a close connection to the environment, the trees, the green. And when you're in a space with an inappropriate sense of scale, you feel uncomfortable. Now, what does that mean? It means if you've got double-storey, triple-storey buildings, or you've got lampposts that are 7 metres high, your trees, some of the plants have to be higher than that. Otherwise, you don't feel comfortable. It's as simple as that. And if you, the example I usually give of this is the MCG. MCG, great big mausoleum, sort of Colosseum. Ugly building. Really is an ugly building. But you never see it as a whole. You come through the parkland, no matter where you come from, there are trees, and you only see a bit of it. People love the MCG. You go to Docklands, same building, a more attractive building in a concrete jungle, people don't like it. And people don't know why. Now, we told the authorities that if you didn't put Docklands in a parkland situation, it would never be sort of accepted and adopted as a people's stadium like the MCG. And it won't be. It's as simple as that. So you need trees, you need something big. Now you're going to say, well, what happens if you haven't got the space? Well, you need the space, you make the space. You've got to get your priorities right. And the trees should be the high priority, not the services that we also need. And I'll come back to that in a minute. They shade, and shade's going to be really important in a few minutes' time. So, given that I'm going to put the point to you, and I'm starting already to say to you that trees do lots of things, but they also do things that we can measure and put an economic value on. Okay, so your botanic gardens is not just important for its history and heritage, which it is. It's not just important because it's beautiful. It's not just important because it's got some great plants in it. It's important because of all the other things that it does. The things that nobody puts a value on, and probably your local government doesn't put a value on it either. Our state government certainly doesn't. So what sort of values? How important is it for kids' development? How important is it for cooling the area around it? How important is it for soaking up rain? How important is it for moderating wind? All of these things. And when you start to look at what those green spaces and tree green spaces do, they are not optional or decorative parts of infrastructure. They are essential components of a sustainable and livable city. It's as simple as that. Now, with botanic gardens, there are some really quite remarkable things, and I know that your garden has a connection with Guilfoyle, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Guilfoyle, because despite what you might have heard, Guilfoyle is also a person very interested in trees. He really understood trees, okay? And quite often, he put the trees first. Isn't that interesting?
It's interesting.
That's what I'm arguing anyway. Okay, don't have a vested interest. Right? So, when you look at this slide, what you're supposed to see is the palm. Are you looking at the palm?
No.
No.
Out of that little promontory. Now, it's not there by a fluke. It's there, and you remember when he put it there was no other green around. It stood out like a beacon. And what were you supposed to do? You looked at the palm, you looked at the tower on Government House, and you knew immediately whether the Gov was in or not. It was a sort of a bit of a doffing of the cap to the colonial authority. Deliberately done. Very clever design. And even today, when I see that site, I cannot help but look at the palm and I automatically look up. I just can't help it. You know, so these sorts of things don't happen by chance. So trees perform functions that we value. They provide vital services. And in our society, anything that performs a function or provides a service has a value, a dollar value. You can work it out. Sometimes it's very difficult, but sometimes it's relatively easy. And I'll give you a few simple examples towards the end of this presentation. Yeah, that's where you live. Improved, hasn't it? Okay, when you look at it, some of you are sitting there thinking, oh look, Lake Pertby, look at those
Little trees.
the trees, yeah, the Norfolk Island. Look, how many trees did you have in your streets then? So people often talk about the good old days. The good old days. That's not the way it works. Things change, and boy, what this tells you is in less than 50 years, if you get it right, geez, can you make a difference? Can you make a difference? So this is an argument against all of those soothsayers who are saying, and namesayers who are saying, climate change, we can't do anything. This proves that you can, and you can do it quite quickly, even in human terms. And certain trees are really quite spectacular. This is the Carsonia at Melbourne University, and it's in Carsonia Court. Now the thing about Carsonia, grows like the clappers. The branches are essentially made of balsa wood, and anyone that knows anything about them, they're going to fall apart. Okay, so how permanent is this? Even though it's a tree in a particular landscape, not very. So to give the university its credit, they propagated from this, and when it fell apart, they had plants ready to put back. They were already quite substantial, and Carsonia Court remained Carsonia Court because someone thought, we'll do a bit of planning, we'll put a bit of money in, we'll know what's going to happen. So, in particular in relation to Botanic Gardens, you people know all of this, but most people don't when I talk to them. So I want to make sure that you've got at least some dot points so that when someone says, why should we spend a few extra dollars on the Botanic Gardens, you can say, well, look, in those Botanic Gardens, in yours and all of the little Botanic Gardens around Victoria, they've been trialling plants for over 100 years. Some of them have worked, some of them hadn't. The ones that didn't work, basically gone. So the plants that have worked, pretty good to look at if you think about it. So if you want to look at native and exotic species that are going to do well in Victoria in various climate sort of conditions, you go to your Botanic Gardens and you get a pretty good insight. Is it perfect? No. Is there anything else? No. You don't. There's not another alternative. So you might as well value what you've got. And even if we just know how fast it grows, how big does it get? So for example, I did some work with one of our students on our Acharias, and we were just curious. He's very curious about conifers, fanatical, in fact. And isn't it fantastic to have a 40-year-old, yet less than 40-year-old, who's absolutely fanatically obsessed with conifers. We need those people, okay? He'll know every conifer in your garden. He'll have been there, he lives in Ballarat, he knows everyone, he's seen them all in their natural habitat, he knows how to propagate them, and if you want one and you get in touch with him and you can't get him anywhere else, he'll grow one for you.
Oh.
Okay, that's what he'll do. So really quite special. But what we discovered very quickly is when you're looking at things like the monkey puzzle, or you're looking at bunya bunyas, and you think they're going to get, say, 20 metres tall, well, add 10. Okay, 30 metres is more likely. When you look at the Woolamai pine, how big is it going to get? Big. Okay, so we know that from this. The gardens are great research material. Their suits still used as seed sources for rare species. And in fact, you probably know this again, because of Australia's quarantine laws, very often it's almost impossible for nurseries and others to import seed. And so if you've got an unusual tree in your garden, then it's going to become an important asset for propagation material. That's just the way the world works. So stock plants, you've got the educational side, preservation and conservation. You know about some of that. You probably know about the wonderful collection of trees that were at the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne for Easter Island, and they were all thought to have come from a clone in a Chilean garden. And so when they were trying to get plants back on Easter Island, they said, "Don't worry, Australia, what would you know about this? We know you've got the material from Chile, and they're all the clones." And in fact, they had 5 different individuals in the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, and that captured about 95% of the genetic material that was in the larger population.
Wow.
It's an amazing story. Okay, and it's not the only one. It's happened before with other gardens in other places. So they really do have a terrifically important role. In relation to climate change, what we find with gardens is that they have a professional approach. So they look after their plants professionally. Some of them only look after them to the extent that their budgets allow. Your garden's quite large, but you think of some of the smaller gardens. You know, maybe you've been to Malmesbury, for example, tiny little botanic garden. You know they're not going to have a lot of money. It's just not on. So, but by and large, you've got professional, scientifically informed management. They're accurate in their data. So if someone sends you in a girth or a height or a planting date, pretty often spot on, nearly always spot on. And they tell us about the performance and the survival of a whole range of species. So you can use that knowledge in sort of looking for what we call climate-ready plants. And you probably know that there are people in local government and elsewhere in Victoria that are not looking just at the gardens in Victoria. They're also looking at gardens in southern New South Wales and South Australia, because places like Melbourne are going to have a climate more like that of Dubbo. Mm-hmm. So you can't look at just the gardens on the other side of the divide. You look at the garden on the other side of the Murray. It's pretty scary stuff. So all of those things really make the role of the gardens very important. Okay, now in the Botanic Gardens at Melbourne, I just wanted to mention Guildford for a few minutes. They did lots of things. You know, he completely redesigned and replanted after von Müller, right? Because von Müller did a very scientific, German, logical, and people hated it. So Guildford came in with his wonderful artistic approach. But did you know he transplanted lots of trees? Lots of trees. And he understood that if he could transplant those trees successfully, all of the years that they'd been growing wouldn't be wasted. And if he had the trees, you created that sense of scale. You gave new parts of the garden height, which you could utilise with other plants. So in other words, you would get an almost instant effect. And so what he wanted to do is he wanted to have those great vistas, the sweeping sort of pathways. He wanted the areas around the waterways made much more attractive. And this is how he designed. So these are his drawings from Pescott's book. And you can see that not all of these came off, by the way, but you can see what he was trying to do is before he planted, he was trying to imagine what they would look like. And he was astonishingly good at it. You know, most of us, when you've got you're thinking of doing something and you're planning for the future, you don't really know how it's going to turn out, do you? And some people find it very difficult to read plans, for example. One of my pieces of advice to people with a tree is if you're going to plant a tree and you've got your little 15 centimetre container, don't wander around with your 15 centimetre container. Imagine that you're wandering around with a tree 2/3 its mature size. Okay, and if you think that way, you won't do dumb things like planting it next to a wall or under a power line or under the eave of your house. You know, and so he was very, very good at doing this sort of thing. And you can see here he's making use, and deliberately so here, conifers. Conifers and araucarias were a big deal at the time. They were being tested for a whole range of properties, mainly timber, and so lots of them. As I said when I walked into your botanic garden, what I'm expecting to see anywhere that Guilfoyle's had an influence, I'm expecting to see palms and araucarias, because they were the sort of the statement and the trophy trees of that particular era, of around the 1870s, 1880s through to about 1920. So you expect to see them. And some of them, of course, are there, and you've got a couple of rippers. Okay, really good ones. So, what did he do? He was moving trees that were up to 11 metres tall. Now think about it, 11 metres tall. And they, in 1874 to 1875, they moved 832 plants and had 6 losses. Okay. Later they did another 685 and 5 losses. And they moved araucarias, cupressus, pinus, brachychiton, all sorts of things. Now it just shows you what is possible. And here they're moving it. Now I find this absolutely fascinating, because here they are, horse and drays, moving not a small tree, okay, and yet if you look at what happens today, can you move a large tree? You'll be told straight away, no, not worth it. Can't do it, it's impossible. We've got all the equipment that these people didn't have. They did it with, what was it, 11 losses in what, 1,250 transplants. That's a fantastic success rate, you see. And so what I'm suggesting here is, if you can imagine it, you can probably do it. You can probably do it. So one of the things that Guilfoyle was also interested in, he wasn't just thinking about trees in a single sense. He was looking at them for lighting events. Sound familiar? Your garden? Yeah? People were thinking of events, they wanted people in. Why did they want people in? They wanted people in their gardens for exactly the same reason I wanted Garden Week at Permanent. I wanted people to come to the gardens. Would they do damage? Yes. Would it be permanent damage? Hopefully not, if we managed them properly, and we did. Why did I want them in? If 200,000 people came, I had 200,000 allies. That's the way I saw it. And the more people that know and love your garden, the much greater the interest and the much greater the defence. And when the university gave us a bit of a tough time in the mid-90s, okay, boy, did those allies come in handy. Word went round that the university was going to sort of meddle with our gardens, and they just got belted. Okay, 1,200 calls in less than 10 days. They got, and the Vice-Chancellor basically said, we'll leave them alone. And they did, pretty much. They were interested in plants for paper making. They were doing acclimatisation trials. So what that meant was they were taking trees deliberately out of their natural and usual environment to see what happened, to see if they would work. And they were looking at timber, gums, resins, fibres, medicines. So when you think about what Guilfoyle was doing, he wasn't just there making something pretty. He was there to serve a function. And if you look at some of those things, they are virtually all economic. All economic, okay? And you won't be surprised that many of the functions of our botanic gardens, our trees, our landscapes are economically driven, even if people don't realise it. The economics of them are really powerful. This was the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne in 1908, and this is one of my postcards, and the people at the gardens have never seen the gardens in this era before. Okay? Isn't that fascinating? And so you can look at that site and you can figure out what's still there, and look at how small the trees are. Okay, so that's 110 years ago, effectively. So Guilfoyle also wanted people to appreciate Australian plants. And I think if he came back today, he'd be terribly disappointed at how few Australians really understand our flora. In a few weeks or a couple of months' time, there's every chance that there's going to be a function put on through the Diggers group. Do you know Diggers? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's going to be titled something like Eucalypts, Friend or Foe. Now I'm going to go into that, be part of that, because I'm not going to let him get away with it. So I'm going to talk, okay? But the fact that that topic has come up really worries me. Really worries me. Because they're eucalypts. They do a fantastic role in many places, and boy, are they poorly understood. And we often make completely unfair comparisons. You know, we want to compare our eucalypts, a eucalypt. So I was giving a talk one day and someone said, "Oh, you talk very glowingly about eucalypts tonight. You should tell us all about the problems." And I said, "Well, which species are you talking about?" And there was just dead silence for a second. And she said, "Is there more than one?" Is there more than one? There's 700. At least 700 different species. And I said to her, "But you can get a eucalypt to do anything. Big ones, small ones, multi-trunk, single trunk, big flowers, small flowers. Big leaves, dull leaves, bright leaves, anything you want. But we don't select and breed. We haven't invested in them. We use, we don't invest." Okay? Now you look at elms, they've been invested in by cultures in the northern hemisphere for at least 1,000 years. Plane trees, we know that plane trees were bred and selected by the Romans. Okay? We also know that the Romans were really good at transplanting them. Because if you had a great big plane tree and you wanted to create a brand new Appia, okay, road to celebrate a victory, well, you didn't just chop all the trees down. You had your slaves, and they had lots of them, and they moved them, and they grew them on, instant effect, way before us. And then we want our flora to compete in those sort of circumstances without spending a cracker on it, and often not even knowing where the seed comes from. Okay, so I'm moving along, and I'm hoping that at the moment, doing pretty well here. I'm not actually going slowly, am I? And what I'm hoping to do in the next few minutes is show you some examples of where things function. So when I see this slide, you can see I'm looking at the Yarra, you can see the parkland, you can see Government House, which I've mentioned earlier. And you might be saying, yes, that really beautifies that part of Melbourne. And it does. And I'm thinking, what's the shade worth? Who gets the benefit of that shade? How much water does it soak up when it rains? How important is that in relation to the size of the pipes that carry away stormwater? I'm wanting to know, there's a road running through there. How much extra life do you get out of the bitumen because of the shade of the trees? Because the shade prolongs the life of the bitumen. So you can see I'm looking at it in a slightly different way. Okay? And I want us all to be looking at it in that way, because if we don't, we're going to be in horrendous trouble with climate change. So this is something I published a while ago, and it shows you in this column, the column on my side, as you look at it, that in North America and Northern Europe, temperatures could rise by 7 to 8 degrees. In Australasia, by 4 degrees. When I first started using these sorts of tables, that column was described as the worst case scenario. And we hardly ever talked about it, because no one thought it would come about. But in fact, that's now the most likely scenario. And some of you in this room will know that if you do have temperatures of 7 or 8 degrees in the northern hemisphere, the ice below the soil, in the soil, will start to melt. And when that happens, methane is released. And if methane is released, it's a much more influential greenhouse gas than CO2, and all of the modelling will be redone. Okay, so if the permafrost starts to collapse, we're in heaps. So where do we go with all of this? Well, you know lots of this. You know that it's going to get warmer. You probably know it's going to get drier. You know we're going to have more winds from the east or the southeast. You probably know that the snow is not going to fall in certain places that depend on it. They're going to be changed fire and weather patterns. And you also know, hopefully, that there's going to be greater flooding, because when the rain does fall, it'll fall in the warmer months and it'll be heavier rainfall. In my worst moments, I think that the climate of Victoria is going to become more like that of Sydney, okay? Which would be terrible, wouldn't it? Giving up a wonderful climate that we have for the climate they have in Sydney. I don't want to get too parochial. So, of course, agricultural productivity will change. You guys know that better than me. And it's not going to always change for the worse, is it? For some of the things that you grow and do, it's going to be fine. You might even have some new opportunities to grow things that you haven't grown in the past. Of course, if you're a stone fruit grower and want a cold winter, you might be looking at Tassie rather than parts of Victoria. So, funny things happen. This photograph of the train and the guy with the hose, does anyone remember seeing that? It was on one of the prestigious journals, I think maybe the Herald Sun. And what this guy is doing is he's hosing down the railway tracks to stop them buckling. And he's using potable water. Okay? A few hundred metres away, there is a same piece of track with the elm trees on either side. There's no one wandering along there with a hose. So you can actually work out how much water he used and what his salary was, and you can say those elms saved us that much money. And it's thousands. So you can do the same for this area. Those trees are going to have an impact on what we call the urban heat island effect. Who's heard of the urban heat island effect? Some of you haven't. The urban heat island effect is where towns like Warrnambool, Hamilton, Ballarat, Bendigo, and cities like Melbourne, because of all the concrete and tar roads, the temperatures are much higher than the surrounding green area. It's called the urban heat island effect, and it's so common now that the acronym UHI has even appeared, you've got it, in the Herald Sun. Okay, so urban heat island effect. So urban heat island effect is usually somewhere between 3 and 6 degrees hotter. Okay, you might say that's not very much. The medical profession will tell you that's enough to kill you in a heat wave, that difference. Okay, so that's how significant it is. Now we're starting to get a bit serious. Okay, so am I saying to you that our treed green space is as important as life and death? And the answer is yes. I am saying that, and I can defend that position. You get it wrong, people die. You get it right, people don't die. Simple as that. So these are not to be sort of thought of as trivial matters. When you're dealing with people's health, their longevity, and whether they live or die in a heat wave, that's serious stuff. And we know all of this. We've known it for quite a long time, and people don't do enough with the information that we've got. So, just in a flippant way, shade, lots of it. Who pays for the maintenance of those gardens? We do. The ratepayers or the taxpayers. Who gets the benefits of the shade? The buildings around it. How do they benefit? They don't have to run their air conditioners for as long. Some days they don't have to run them at all because it's just below the threshold. And they can save literally tens and thousands of dollars in a year. Now, is that fair? Should they get the benefit and we pay? And my point of view on this, by the way, it's just a question, because I actually think it probably is fair. If everyone, the economy benefits, more jobs, money goes round, society's better off. I'm more than comfortable with that notion, okay? But what I want is I want recognition. I want people who get the benefits to know that it's the vegetation providing those benefits, and I don't want it taken for granted. I don't want them to be doing dumb things like thinking we can just build something on there, okay? If we lose a bit of green space, who cares? That sort of thing. I want it understood and I want it appreciated. And these sorts of functions are manifold. So this is on the back of an envelope of a few things that I could think of that trees provide, the benefits and services. And when I first did this on the back of an envelope, over 20 years ago, I had about 10 things that I could write down. Now, did I think there were more? Yes. So why were there only 10? Because they were the ones we had data on. There was scientific research for about 10 things that you could prove trees provided a benefit, a service, a function. Then it went up to about 20, and then I couldn't fit them on a sheet. So there's many more than that, but I've left it at that. And some of those, I could speak to you for 3 hours. Some of them I could speak to you for 3 weeks about things, okay? Some of them are worth millions upon millions, and some of them are worth billions of dollars. So it just shows you how quickly things have changed. And that was one of the themes of earlier on, wasn't it? Things can change quickly. When I first started looking at the interactions of trees and human health, I knew all the references. I had a list with them on, a couple of pages with them all on. These days, in a week, that many come out. I can't keep up. I've given up trying to keep up. The connections between human health and tree green space is so well researched and there's so much information, I can't keep up anymore. I've given up. There's just too much. So, to give you a few examples, Black Saturday, 173 people died in bushfires. In the heat wave surrounding Black Saturday, 374 people died. Lots of Victorians don't know that. Just don't know it. And most of them were over 70. Most of them lived in the northern and western suburbs of Melbourne, but others lived in other parts of the state, certain of the big towns. And when the Department of Health looked at where people died, they found that the little red dots weren't randomly distributed across a city or across a state. They clustered, and the strongest correlation where people died was lack of treed green space. The lack of treed green space. Now, do you notice I used the word correlation? We're not saying there's cause and effect, because these are complicated matters. There are issues to do with socioeconomic status and all of those sorts of things. We know that it's much more complicated. But that was the single strongest correlation. It was so strong that the Department of Health said, well, we've got some other areas where they're very low in tree green space. How come people didn't die? And one of them was a relatively new housing estate. Not a tree to be seen. Why didn't people die? Because they were young. They were double income families. They ran their conditioners 24 hours a day for 10 days so that they could live in their homes. If they didn't have air conditioning, they couldn't live in their homes, or they would be at risk of death. Okay? So that was one of the demographics. They also used the information to say, in Melbourne and in other major regional centres, in areas where there are no or few treed green spaces, when a heat wave is predicted, they warn the doctors, they warn the ambulances, and they warn the hospitals. Get ready for some customers. It's getting hot. That's how good the correlation is. That is brilliant. That is brilliant, but it's also tragic. Okay? So, the other interesting thing, and I love this is from our Victorian Department of Health, and the guy that's behind it was a policy officer called Deadman, which I also love, for a Department of Health official. And the thing that he worked out, and he's a good guy, this is one of the good guys in the bureaucracies. He worked out with his colleagues that if Victorians, 1 to 2% more Victorians, could actively or passively recreate, then we would save $274 million per annum off the Victorian health bill. Now, some of you in this room are probably social scientists, and to change people's behaviour is not easy. Just even to get 1 to 2% more is difficult. So they commissioned Deakin University to do a study, and they said, look, if we want to get 1 to 2% more people to actively or passively recreate, and the difference, by the way, passive recreation, going for a stroll, a walk, hopping on a bike, active recreation in some sort of organised sport. And Deakin came back and said, we've done the research, give them treed green space, particularly in summer. And you get that's more than double all the money spent by all the councils on all the trees and all the parks in our state in a year. Okay, so think about that. Absolutely like COVID. Yep, absolutely. And I'm not going to have time, but there are COVID slides on here, I can assure you. I'm just keeping an eye. I don't want to keep you too much longer. This is some of my own data. If you've got 2 medium-sized trees to the north or northwest of your property, the shade that they provide will save you something around $200, maybe $250 this year because of the increased electricity bills, in electricity costs for driving a sort of a traditional 6 kilowatt air conditioner in your property. So that's a significant saving. Just 2 medium-sized trees. And medium-sized trees, by the way, definition 8 to 10 metres. Not great whoppers, just medium-sized trees. I'm associated with a group called TreeNet. They operate out of Adelaide, and I've been with them for 22 or 23 years. And in 2002, we persuaded the Professor of Economics at the University of South Australia to get 2 of his honours students to answer what we thought was a pretty interesting and simple question. And the question was, how much money does a large street tree growing in the centre of Adelaide provide to the citizens of Adelaide? How much value does it provide? Relatively simple question. Turned out it wasn't as simple as we thought. Work had been done overseas, never anything like it in Australia. And at the end of the year, the 2 honours students came to our conference and they said, this is preliminary, not a lot of information, we don't have all the answers, but we figure that each tree, and these trees in Adelaide, they could have been a plane tree, because you know there's lots of them in Adelaide. They could have been an elm, some of them, not as many as in places like Melbourne or Camperdown, that sort. Could have been a big eucalypt. Okay, any of those sort of big mature trees. They said it returns $171 of benefits to the citizens of Adelaide. Now, you're all hard nuts. You know what business is like. Your immediate question is, what does it cost to maintain a tree in the city of Adelaide? And the answer varied a little bit, but it's around $10. So you get $171 of value for each $10 that you spend. Sound like a good deal? So in 2009, the same professor put a PhD student on the case. So had 3 years, information was much more readily available. And his estimate was each tree provided $424 of value. Now I know you've got the same question. 7 years on, how much does it cost to maintain these trees now? And the answer was $10. There'd been no extra allocation. Same. It's a very good deal. Now if you think this is sort of, oh, that's too good to be true, around the world, the usual ratios that people talk about benefit in terms of cost is somewhere between 6 and 12. So for every dollar you spend, you get somewhere between 6 and 12. So we're pretty much in the sort of the ball game. This one is a bit high, but that's a sort of a general rule around the world. Now I thought you might be interested in a couple of things before we really start wrapping up. What happens if you prune trees for power lines? So if you prune trees for power lines, I've done some modelling using the value of the Rudd-Gillard government of $23 a tonne for carbon, okay? And you might say, why would you use that number? I use that number because it's the only agreed number that we've ever had in Australia. No, there's been no other official formal number. If I was to use the current value in Europe, that number would be at least double and possibly triple what it is. So what it tells you is if you do a standard tree pruning of 100 trees, because they operate contracts to arborists in numbers, you're going to prune off about 30% on average. It's very rare that they do less than 30%. And if you prune off 30%, you're pruning off $4,500 worth of carbon. Now, if you said to the power line companies, I want compensation for that, okay, because you're greenhouse gas villains, which they are, that they would underground instantly. Because it would completely change the economic algorithm, which makes above ground systems sort of viable. Change it overnight. So when you hear people saying, unless we put a value on carbon, things aren't going to really change. And some of you won't like the idea of a value on carbon, I do understand that. But as soon as you do, the economic algorithms that sort of govern the decision-making processes and result in this sort of thing happening would change. And you would almost certainly underground. And this is because these pruning cycles happen every 3 to 5 years. Now, how long have we known about this? Years. We Victorians are amongst the worst CO2 producers per capita, as you know, because of our electricity produced from brown coal. It's not terribly efficient. So, but we compound the problem by pruning trees, which would sequester the carbon to allow the power lines through. You know, there's a certain, if the Monty Python team, and it's not just the above ground parts of the trees that provide the benefits. The root systems also sequester carbon, and we know almost certainly that when we work out how much carbon there's sequestered in soil, and some of you as farmers will be very interested in this, we know that the algorithms currently used for trees underestimate the below ground carbon enormously because we don't really have good data on the mycorrhizal fungi that are associated with the roots. Who doesn't know what mycorrhizal fungi are? Anyone? Mycorrhizal fungi are the fungi that wrap themselves around the roots of all of the trees in your botanic gardens and all of the trees everywhere. There's two types. Some just wrap around the roots and they use sugars from the tree to grow on, and then their very fine threads provide absorptive surface area for the roots to take up water and nutrients. It's a beautiful relationship. And the red and white toadstool that you see near pines, the Amanita muscaria, the deadly one, it's the fruiting body of a mycorrhizal fungus. Some other mycorrhizal fungi grow into the cells of the individual roots. They're called endomycorrhiza, and that's about as intimate a relationship as you can get.
Can you see them with your naked eye?
Yes. So you can see the fruiting bodies, and for eucalypts, for example, the fruiting body, you'll have seen them. It'll be a cream and a light tan mushroom, usually about 75 millimetres across, usually occurring somewhere around 4 or 5 metres from the trunk. Now, but that's not the question you asked me. I'm going to answer the question you asked. If you look at the soil and you've got really good healthy soil, you'll see little fine, what look like white cotton wool running through. That's the fungus. Okay.
So what
And
happens if cars are allowed to park on continually? Say Meride Crescent, for example, under the beautiful Norfolk pine trees.
Yeah.
So what damage is that doing?
Lots. Lots. And so trees are adaptable. You might find that where those cars are parking, that's called compaction. As soon as you compact the soil, you lower the soil O2. As soon as you lower the O2, mycorrhizal fungi bugger off, okay? Because they like oxygen. So, but what the roots will probably do is they'll proliferate somewhere else. So the trees may remain healthy despite the way we treat them, but of course, that can also add to their stress level, and that's when you start to lose them. You've got to think of what's going on below the ground. And most people, I'm not going to give you a lecture on tree roots because that's a whole other topic, but most people don't know that big trees hardly ever have a taproot. Those of you on farms will know this. Almost always when a tree falls over, you've got a little shallow dish. Okay, same in a suburban street. So what holds a big tree up? The lateral roots, the spreading roots, okay? And they're close to the surface because if you were a tree root, think about where you'd want to be. Do you want to be down in the depths where there's no oxygen, not much water, no nutrients? No, you're going to be where the good life is, close to the surface, lots of water, lots of organic matter, lots of nutrients, lots of oxygen. That's where you're going to be. And of course, if you grow like that, each year a new tree grows over the old wood. So those roots are going to start off, say, 3 inches or so, 75 mil below the soil surface, and then they're going to grow and grow, and they're going to come to the surface, and you're not going to like it. Okay? And what can you do about it? Nothing. Appreciate it. Different. No, don't put soil over the top. Put mulch. Never put fill.
Okay, right.
Never put fill. If you're going to put fill, and particularly if you're going to put more than about 70 millimetre, you're asking for big trouble, particularly with a big old tree.
Right. Okay.
Mulch, 75 to 100 mils, not a problem. That's usually a really good thing. Okay, and if you go above 100 mils and you start getting 200 or 300 mils of mulch, not a good thing.
So how much mulch was it then, Dr. Ball?
75,
75.
yeah, Greg will do. It saves us time. Now, this is the root system of an elm. Have a look at it. Where are all the roots? Pretty much under the tree. Pretty much under the drip line. This is the root system. Oh, did I skip it? It skipped it, I'm afraid. You're not going to see it. The root system of a eucalypt or a plane tree, big structural roots, and the absorbing roots are somewhere 40 metres away into a drain or into a water course. Okay. So, do different trees have different root systems? You betcha they do. Point being, there's as much of the tree below the ground, if not more, than above, and it has a real economic value. Okay, I'm going to start wrapping up. I don't think I've got... Yes, I wanted to get to this one, because I saw some eyebrows raised a while ago. If you've got a tree-lined street, then the bitumen in that tree-lined street can have its life extended because of the shade. So bitumen is like glass. It's a super cooled liquid, and it has a solvent in it, and when the solvent evaporates off, the bitumen becomes crumbly, okay? And then you have to resheet the street. So what you find is if you've got a tree-lined street, the life of the bitumen is extended by 2 or 3 times. 2 or 3 times. Now, this is based on overseas research. There's no research in Australia. None. So what this model does is it shows you a typical urban street of about a kilometre or half a kilometre long, and it's got trees on both sides, 7 metres wide, okay? If it's a new development, it'd only be 6, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And it shows you that the bitumen's life has been extended not by double or triple, but by a half. This is very, very conservative. Very conservative. So it's gone from 20 years to 30 years. And the amount of money you would save each time you have to resheet that street is $1.7 million. Now, I just wanted to present that to you because every council that I know of could tell you to the cent how much damage is done to its footpaths and curbs by tree roots. None of them could tell you any of the streets where the bitumen has been prolonged. They're not interested. They don't collect the data. They know of streets that have never been resheeted as often as the others. Okay, so they know that shade has an impact. And the point I make here is this is me arguing for a fair go. I just want a proper cost-benefit analysis. I know of a tree that was worth $30,000 that was removed because it caused damage to a footpath, and the damage was worth $417.32. Okay? So if you don't know these things, you don't get your priorities right. So, in finishing up, and I know we're over time, but that was because of our delayed start. So I'm claiming innocence on this. It's just worrying that when people recognise that trees have these values, we're still losing them. We're still losing more trees than we're getting. And, you know, there are some really bold programs at the moment. People want to plant another 2 billion trees. Bob Hawke, remember? I'm going to plant 1 billion trees. He didn't quite get there. They planted 1 million trees, just short. 900 million they planted. Problem was, they lost 3. They lost 3 billion trees while they were planting these elsewhere. So the moral of the story is you've got to fight to keep what you've got, and if you're going to deal with climate change effectively and efficiently, you have to increase your canopy cover. And in a place like Warrnambool, what should your canopy cover be? And the canopy cover you should be aiming for is 30%. 30% canopy cover gives you all of the benefits. You get a law of diminishing returns. So as your canopy cover goes up, you get more and more and more benefits until you get to about 30% and it starts to level off. Okay? So if you've got a target of 30% canopy cover, you're onto a winner. You get lots of benefits. Yeah?
I asked the council what our current rate was about 12 months ago. I think we're about 5%.
Yeah.
At the moment.
That'd be right.
The Green Plan for council has got a target of 40%.
Yes. So
it's an aspirational view.
yes.
And yeah, we're probably between 5 and 10 years behind where we were hoping to be. So that compounds every year. So
Yep.
There's an awful lot of work to do. There's no
Yeah.
two ways about it.
Well, it's interesting that the 40% number probably comes from the target that Melbourne City Council have set, because a lot of Victorians have looked at their urban forestry strategy, which is a very good one, and Melbourne City Council went for 40% because they thought if they went for 40 they might get to 30. Okay, so that's what they did. The interesting thing about many councils, over half of the councils in Melbourne have less than 20%, and of that half, about half have around 10%. So you're not by any means on your own. The interesting thing that will happen, I'm pretty confident, in a place like Warrnambool, because it's happening everywhere else, is you're going to find that you're going to have real difficulty getting to 30% because of the way your city changes and develops. So what's happening in various parts of Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, Adelaide, to a lesser extent Brisbane, they have these aspirations. And if you look at public land, the canopy cover on public land is usually pretty good. Doesn't usually drop much because councils are now looking after their reserves and their streets and so on. But very often they've then started to plant into the gaps. But what happens when there aren't any more gaps? And you've got big blocks of land in Warrnambool, and it's inevitable that some of the big old houses with lots of trees are going to be knocked down. And when they do it, they'll do exactly what they do in Melbourne. They'll stick big houses on tiny blocks, no trees. And this is happening all over the place. I've seen it in Benalla, I've seen it in Balan, I've seen it, I went through one of the suburbs in Ballarat yesterday. Oh, God. Anyway.
How'd you wait?
Yeah. Canberra, same thing. Burley Griffin must be sort of spinning in his grave, not just rolling. And what you're going to find is having aspirational targets, you have to have them. Of course you have to. Otherwise you'll never get there. No hope of getting there. But boy, it's not going to be easy because the developers have got hold of the Victorian government planning rules and they're all to their advantage. Any other questions?
It's very depressing.
It can be depressing. Any other? Yeah.
Yeah, I see a lot of problem in the removal of trees, and you know, if a tree looks a bit dangerous, it gets removed, and often that tree is obviously mature and large,
Yep.
and it's going to take ages to get the same
To
sort
replace
of effect. You know, they'll take down the tree, maybe 2 years later they'll plant a few seedlings, and it's going to be 20 years before anything happens.
So just a couple of things on this. We are now amongst the most risk-averse people we in Victoria are much more risk-averse than other states. We used to be much more environmentally friendly.
Mm.
But we've fallen under this sort of perversion of managing risk. Just as a matter of interest, the odds of a person who's not involved in forestry or arboriculture being killed by a tree in Australia is 1 in 5.4 million. Okay? It's much lower than of being hit by lightning. It's much, much, much lower risk than your bathroom, your stairs, or your couch. So if you were to take the view, that we'll remove all trees because of the risk, you wouldn't have any of those accoutrements in your home. So we are very strange in the way that we deal with risk. And in your botanic garden, you've got, I think, what did you call it? The money tree? The money tree, where they've spent quite a bit of money on various bits of what I'll call hardware to keep the structure together. And by and large, that's going to be a pretty good investment. Given the size of that tree and the value of that tree, it's worth spending that money. And there are some new pieces of technology that if you had to sort of reinforce it again, you wouldn't use old style cables and hardware. You use the strapping systems, and your council's familiar with them. Your council officers know about this. And these technologies have been around now for at least a decade, and they're widely used. They're much less sort of invasive, and they cause far fewer problems, and they give you much higher levels of safety. So one of the themes of this evening's talk is, by all means, do a cost-benefit analysis. By all means, I'm more than happy to line up against someone and they say, well, that tree could do this, and I can say, well, that tree actually does this. That's not the risk, this is what it actually does, okay? And the trees do fall, no question, branches do come off. Usually, people know, not always. So, while I'm in the Western District, I might as well talk about this. When I was at Cavendish in April for the Cavendish Red Gum Festival, people tell me that red gums drop limbs and fall over without warning. Okay, and some of you are going, yeah, but is that true? Is there any data that compares red gums with oaks or red gums with elms? And what does the data say? And the answer is, there is no data. Okay, so do we have any data? Yes. I can tell you what tree is the biggest killer of people in the city of Melbourne. I can tell you what that is. And you won't be surprised, it's the elm tree. Why? Because there's lots of them. They've been mucked around with, their root systems have been cut through for 6-7 times in a century. And where do people gather for festivities? Under elm trees in Melbourne. Okay? But elms, nobody thinks elms are dangerous. Now you come to River Red Gum, and they're the most widely distributed eucalypt of all. Where do they grow? They grow along rivers and waterways. Where do Australians go to recreate? Along rivers and waterways. How do they get where? In great big 4 bloody wheel drives. What do? They compact the blazes out of the soil. Okay? What do you expect a tree to do when you compact? You expect it to drop something. Okay, so is it the case that river red gums drop more than others? We don't know. Okay, and anecdotal evidence, you've got to treat anecdotal evidence with great caution. Okay, because people will tell you whatever they like. For example, I'll tell you, one of my former students didn't like spotted gum. They drop things. Where's your data? I don't have any, but I know they drop things. Well, how about getting some numbers? No, they drop things. So we went out with one of my master's students and we had a look at different populations of spotted gum. And some of them have lots of codominant stems, which means they're likely to drop things, okay? But there's a population in Victoria called Eucalyptus, or Corymbia now, Corymbia maculata henryi, that grows in the Mottal Range down near Mallacoota. No codominant stems. Great canopies. Are we breeding and selecting that one for use in the street? No, of course not. Okay. Do any nurseries collect seed? Couple do. There are a couple of good nurseries that I know where they have an arboricultural interest, and they've gone out and specifically collected from that because they know they are unlikely to shed. Simple as that. Any final questions before we wrap it up? Yeah.
Or comment on anything. You mentioned TreeNet earlier. I've
Yes.
been to that in the past, and some great projects we work with TreeNet and
Yep.
previous council. But John and Paul from the Gardens are both going to the TreeNet Symposium at Wade Institute in October.
In September?
September,
Yes.
yeah. Might be a good thing for the Friends to perhaps request a presentation of the learnings when they come back, perhaps.
Yeah, look, it'd be well worth the while. You're speaking to the converted here. And the TreeNet's a terrific conference. And I go to the Arboriculture Australia conference and the TreeNet conference. I go to TreeNet every year. I go to the Arbos every second year on average. And this year they've been terrific conferences. The TreeNet one is in the first Thursday and Friday of September. It always is. And I'm speaking on a completely different topic there, on connectivity of open space. And for those of you that are wondering what connectivity means, I'm not going to give you the lecture, but the connectivity means how far can you go in a treed green space without facing obstruction, like a set of stairs or a road or a railway line. And I did some work that showed that you needed long connected spaces to meet the future needs, particularly after COVID, of urban citizens. And so to give you, I think about this all the time, but this morning I went for a jog around Hamilton Lake. Okay, what a great space. Nearly 4K, beautiful surface, very cold this morning and a bit misty, I've got to admit, but still great space. Lake Wendouree. You know, Lake Wendouree, because of Lake Wendouree and the track around it, that's attracting events to that city. And I know that in a couple of weeks' time, Athletics Victoria runs a 15-kilometre run around it. There'll be about 1,000 people at that event, okay, they're actually running. There'll probably be closer to 6,000 to 7,000 people. Many of them, at the end of the run, head off to one of the local hostelries or restaurants, okay. We get our fuel, okay, so those sorts of spaces are really, really valuable. And what we found in COVID is that the treed green spaces had a huge impact on people's mental and physical well-being. If I can go further than that, those treed green spaces have huge impacts on children's development. So I was a bit naughty at Hamilton yesterday by saying, you probably heard, particularly if you listen to some of the radio stations, people saying, oh, all these kids that haven't been able to go to school because of the lockdowns, they're going to be put behind, you know, for years and blah, blah. Well, my wife and I, and she's sitting down the back there, when there were lockdowns wrong, we took our grandkids out into the green and tree spaces that were not far from home, and we let them go. They went on fungi hunts, they insects and so on. Now, from what I know about the importance of treed green space on developing spatial capacities, resilience, the use of all your senses at once, you know, multitasking when you go through a space, I wonder whether they were any worse off or, in fact, were they better off? Are we going to see in a few years' time? Curious, all these kids that went out into the green spaces during COVID are doing really well. Okay, because I reckon there's a real chance that that's going to happen.
All these lockdown kids in Victoria returned the highest NAPLAN results in the country.
Yes, interesting,
So
isn't it?
it's not all bad.
Yeah, there's been a lot of sort of negativity.
But just on the, sorry to butt in again, you spoke earlier about cost-benefit exercise. Through the TreeNet link that we had when I was working with the City of Whyalla, we did an exercise around the replacement of curb and channel and footpath.
Yes.
Because I reckon if I had $5 for every time I heard your trees affected my view or your tree has broken my footpath,
Yep.
you've got to cut it down. I could have retired about 10 years ago. So we did an exercise around how many times you could replace a piece of curb and channel and a piece of footpath
Yes.
in the life of that tree before the economics tipped in favour of the curb and channel.
Yep.
And I think it was in the hundreds.
It's in the hundreds of years. It is.
Yeah, so every time we replaced a piece of footpath in those days, it was about $380. And a tree in an environment that you get about 100 mil a year of rain was probably in the order of about $15,000 to $20,000 the value of the tree.
That's right. Absolutely right. You had one last question.
Yes, just regarding hollow trees, often you get a semi-qualified arborist come along, the tree's hollow, it's going to fall down, it's got to come down.
Yeah. Well, there's no explaining ignorance.
Thank you very much.
So there's no look. A hollow tree is not necessarily structurally unsound. A good arborist will be able to tell you. So, for example, the way trees work, they're much more likely to be hollow up and down. It's just the biology. And some of you in the room will know that a hollow cylinder is actually stronger than a solid cylinder of the same diameter. The same sort of physics applies to a tree. Now, that doesn't mean that all hollow trees are safe, but if you've got good tree growth around a hollow, very often that tree is there, safe and sound, and in fact, you probably know, given the question you've asked, that it takes between 150 and 250 years for trees to hollow out to provide all of the sorts of habitats they need. So if we keep chopping down hollow trees, we keep limiting the biodiversity. So it's just got to stop. And people know this. Look, in Victoria, Australia-wide, there's a shortage of arborists. Isn't that interesting? There is a shortage. And the industry is so concerned, it's running a campaign called Arborists Don't Grow on Trees, which I think is a really good campaign. And the point I would make, though, is in Victoria, there are lots of good arborists. I mean, hundreds of them have gone through Burnley, and sometimes we're training now people who are landscape architects. They're coming out to learn about trees, because landscape architects, by and large, know nothing about the plants they recommend. They've done no horticulture, so they just don't know. So they tend to work with a small suite of plants, and they tend to use the same plants over and over again.
Yep.
Now, I'm going to finish there because I know some of you will have other plans and you'll start to want to go, and so I don't want to keep you here. I want to thank you for coming, and I'm also happy to stay and talk to people if they want to.
And we've got a new appreciation for our gardens, and certainly much to think about with our city as well. So I do have a small gift for you, which I will locate shortly.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.